The stones were always cold. Even in summer, when the sun baked the courtyards outside, the kitchen floor felt like ice beneath her bare feet. The air was thick with smoke and garlic, pots clanging, voices barking orders. She moved through it silently, a bucket in her small hands, rough wool scraping her arms, ash smudged across her cheek. No one looked at her. Not really. To them she was a shadow, a pair of hands to scrub, to carry, to fetch, too small to matter, too quiet to notice. When a spoon slipped from the table and clattered to the ground, she was already there, bending, picking it up, before the noble even turned his head. When the fire hissed low, she stoked it without a word. When they laughed, cursed, drank, she listened, always listening, and in that silence she was learning. Who feared debt? Who envied their brother? Who loved someone they should not love? She had no book, no tutor, no crown, but she had ears, and ears sharper than any blade. They thought she was nothing, a servant born to dust and labour, a child too meek to resist, too invisible to remember. But history has a cruel habit. It forgets the ones who kneel, and it fears the ones who rise. No one knew then, in that kitchen of smoke and stone, that the girl scrubbing floors, the one with calloused hands and quiet eyes, would one day make the nobles of Spain tremble, and she would do it without raising her voice, because silence, once her cage, would become her crown. She was 9 when her life was sold, not for love, not for choice, but for coins stacked in a pouch that jingled in her father's trembling hand. The noble house took her in, as one takes in a mule, a body for work, a mouth to keep shut, a shadow to blend into the stones of their halls. Her bed was a pile of straw in the corner of the scullery, her blanket, whatever rags were not torn enough to be burned. Morning began before the roosters, with a slap of a wooden spoon against the table. Up, work. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled. She carried buckets so heavy her arms shook. And when she slowed, the older servants mocked her. Faster, rat. Faster, or we'll tell the mistress. When the mistress came, it was worse. A hand across the face for water spilled, a belt for stepping where she shouldn't, and always the humiliation. Laughter when she stumbled, curses when she cried. The nobles didn't see her at all. To them, she was furniture, a plate polished, a floor swept, a nameless child at the edge of their vision, invisible, and yet invisibility had its uses. No one noticed when she lingered in corners. No one questioned when she bowed her head and waited in silence. They spoke freely around her, forgetting she was there. She heard the ladies' whispered quarrels with her lover. She heard the steward's trembling voice as he admitted debts he couldn't repay. She heard secrets traded over wine, lies rehearsed before council, names muttered in anger when doors were half shut. Every insult, every punishment, every bruise pressed a lesson into her skin. Do not be heard, do not be seen, but never stop listening. She obeyed outwardly, eyes lowered, lips pressed tight, hands folded in submission. But inside, she was storing it all, every word, every glance, every weakness. The older servants thought they were breaking her. The nobles thought she was nothing. But she was studying them, learning what made them fear, what made them fight, what made them bleed. She was a child chained to labour, but already she understood. Power does not always come from speaking. Sometimes it comes from silence. Silence was her cage, but it was also her weapon. By the time she was 13, her hands no longer smelled only of soap and ash. She'd been moved closer to the noble family, no longer in the kitchens but in the chambers. A lady's maid, a shadow dressed in plain wool, always a step behind her mistress. The halls were quieter here, but the whispers were sharper. The air carried secrets, not smoke, and she listened. She noticed how the Lord's laughter grew louder when the steward brought him wine. Wine the steward could not afford. She noticed how the mistress's jewels disappeared for days at a time, only to return after nights when her husband was away. She noticed which courtiers trembled at the sight of the king's seal, which men bowed too deeply, which women hid letters in the folds of their gowns. She polished silver and heard confessions disguised as gossip. She brushed hair and memorized the tones of jealousy woven through compliments. She poured wine and caught glances that should not have been exchanged. They thought she was too small, too meek, too unworthy of attention. But she was storing everything, every bribe, every betrayal, every fear that slipped from their lips when they believed no one was listening. And then it happened. The moment her silence became more than survival. A fellow servant, clumsy, tired, spilled wax across the mistress's new silk. The punishment would have been brutal, dismissal, beatings, perhaps worse. The mistress's voice rose sharp as a blade, but before the blow could fall, the girl spoke, softly, carefully. "Perhaps, my lady, the stain might be hidden, as you hid the ruby necklace when the Duke visited last week." The room went still. The mistress froze. Her eyes widened, not in fury but in fear, and then slowly she lowered her hand. "Take it to the wash," she muttered. Nothing more. The servant was spared. The girl was not punished, and in that moment she felt it, the weight of a secret used as a shield, the power of knowing something others could not afford to be known. From then on, her silence was not just obedience, it was strategy. She learned to guard her words, to let her eyes linger just long enough to suggest she knew more than she said. She did not threaten. She did not beg. She simply remembered. And the court began to sense it. They avoided speaking too freely in front of her. They sent her out of rooms too quickly, but by then it was too late. She already carried their sins in her memory, catalogued like weapons waiting to be unsheathed. At night, lying on her thin straw mattress, she did not dream of freedom. She dreamed of precision, how a single whisper, placed in the right ear, could topple a noble greater than any sword. Born a servant, yes, but in the shadows of Spain's nobility, she was learning to listen like a queen. She was 15 when the walls closed in. It began with a whisper she wasn't meant to hear. A lord, drunk on his own arrogance, speaking in hushed tones to the steward. Gold exchanged hands, loyalty promised, a plot against the very man whose roof sheltered them all. She hadn't meant to listen, but listening had become her nature, and when the Lord turned, his eyes caught hers in the reflection of a polished goblet. Too late. He knew she had heard. By morning, the story had changed. She was accused. A servant girl, they said, caught stealing words not meant for her ears, or perhaps stealing coin. The charge shifted like sand, but the punishment did not. They dragged her into the courtyard. The other servants watched from the shadows, too afraid to speak, too relieved it was not them. The lash tore across her back, each strike louder than her screams, until she stopped screaming, until she stopped moving, until the silence swallowed her whole. They left her there, broken in body, humiliated in spirit, certain they had crushed her. A lesson, they said, a warning. But in the darkness of that night, lying on the cold stone, she understood something no lash could beat out of her. Obedience had not saved her. Silence had not protected her. Survival would never come from being small or meek or invisible. It would come from control, not control of whips or chains, not control of titles or crowns, but control of herself, her face, her voice, her silence. When she returned to service, she was changed. Her eyes no longer betrayed fear. Her lips no longer trembled when spoken to. She gave answers that were safe, smiles that were shallow, gestures so precise they could not be faulted. No one could read her, and that was her victory. Because fear only works when the victim flinches, and she no longer gave them that satisfaction. They thought the punishment had broken her, but in truth it had sharpened her. It had burned away the last pieces of the child she once was. What remained was colder, quieter, more dangerous. She would obey when they watched. She would bow when they demanded. But beneath that mask of submission, she was carving something new. The girl who once endured chains and lashes now carried a different weapon, an unreadable silence, a silence that frightened even those who had tried to destroy her. From that day on, she no longer survived by obedience, she survived by control. She spoke less after that day, not out of fear, not out of obedience, but because she had discovered the power of silence. A question asked of her was met with an answer, never too much, never too little. Yes, my lady. As you wish, my lord. Measured, safe, impossible to fault. When she was scolded, she did not defend herself. When she was praised, she did not glow. Her face became a mask of stillness, polished until no one could see beyond it. And it worked. They stopped looking at her as a burden. They stopped looking at her as a risk. They barely looked at her at all. And that was when she began to listen even more closely. At meals, she mirrored their expressions. When they laughed, she let her lips curve just enough. When they frowned, she bowed her head. When they sighed, she matched the weight of it with her own. She became a reflection of those around her, so precise that people began to trust her without knowing why. Because nothing disarms a man faster than believing he's been understood. Soon, nobles who once ignored her began to speak freely in her presence. They told her things in passing, small confessions, careless remarks, secrets too dangerous to leave written on paper. They never imagined she would keep them all, every detail stored and sharpened like a blade. One lady whispered her fears of a rival cousin. The girl nodded, silent, absorbing every word. A knight boasted of victories that weren't his own. She lowered her gaze, filing away the lie. A steward complained of debts too deep to climb out of. She gave him no judgment, only stillness. And in that stillness, he confessed more than he should have. They believed she was harmless, too quiet to betray them, too small to matter. And so they laid their vulnerabilities before her like offerings at an altar. But she was not loyal to them. Not to the lady who dressed her in fine gowns. Not to the knight who grinned when he spoke her name. Not to the steward who slipped coins from the treasury. She was loyal only to herself. When two nobles quarrelled, she carried whispers to both sides, just enough to make them trust her more, just enough to keep herself protected no matter who won. When one mistress doubted her husband's fidelity, the girl listened patiently, comforting in silence, all the while remembering the face of the woman her master secretly courted. She never lied outright. She never raised her voice. She never stepped beyond her station. But she nudged. She guided. She allowed people to reveal themselves, then tucked their truths away for later. At night, alone in her chamber, she repeated their words to herself, memorizing them until she could recall every phrase, every tremor in a voice, every flicker of weakness. And she began to realize something. Power was not in titles, not in crowns, not in armies. It was in knowledge. Knowledge no one suspected she carried. She'd been born a servant, but in the silence she had mastered, she was already something more, a strategist, a mirror, a weapon wrapped in plain cloth, and the most dangerous part was this. No one saw her coming. By the time she was 17, she was no longer just a maid. She was the shadow at a noble woman's side, the one who held the keys, who delivered the letters, who remembered every word spoken in private chambers. At first, it was simple errands. Carry this note to the steward. Deliver this jewel to the goldsmith. Fetch the doctor at midnight, but tell no one why. She did it all without hesitation, without question, and with every errand she learned more. The noble woman began to lean on her, not just for chores but for counsel. Do you think he loves me still? Do they whisper about me at court? Should I trust her? And the girl, silent, careful, answered with what she knew they wanted to hear. Never too much, never too bold, but always enough to plant a seed. The queen herself noticed her composure, a child yet so precise, so unshaken. Soon she was trusted with letters sealed in wax, messages never meant for the eyes of servants. She carried them with steady hands, memorizing the words before they reached their destination. She became more than a maid. She became a vessel of secrets, and secrets, in the right hands, could move kingdoms. It began quietly. A rival lady laughed too freely in the queen's presence. Days later, a rumour spread about her husband's debts, about her brother's betrayal. The rival's reputation withered, and the girl remained silent. A knight boasted too loudly, mocking those above him. Soon after, whispers of cowardice on the battlefield stained his name. He left court in disgrace, his armour packed away in shame. No one traced the whispers back to her. Why would they? She was only the servant girl, the one who carried trays, the one who bowed her head. But they began to notice a pattern. Those who mocked her fell from grace. Those who underestimated her disappeared. Not with blades, not with poison, but with shame and ruin so complete it might as well have been death. And the nobles started to whisper in hushed tones, the servant girl who never speaks, yet everyone fears. She did not need to raise her voice. Her silence was enough. Her stillness was unsettling. Because when she entered a room, people remembered what had happened to others, and they lowered their voices, and they smiled too quickly, and they wondered, what does she know? The noble woman she served grew stronger, her enemies falling one by one, and behind her victories unseen was the girl who had learned to listen like no other. She was no longer invisible, but she was still unreadable, and that was more powerful than any crown. For in a court ruled by ambition, by greed, by hunger for power, the quietest figure in the room had become the one pulling the strings. By her 20s, she was no longer seen as a servant. No tray in her hands, no rag on her shoulder. When she entered the chamber, the servants bowed, and the nobles straightened their backs. She had no title, no land, no family name worthy of respect, and yet men who commanded armies lowered their voices when she passed. Women of noble birth glanced toward her before speaking, as if seeking permission. She had become something far greater than her station, a shadow that touched everything. The king himself began to call on her, not in public, never in council, but in quiet rooms, away from watching eyes. "Tell me what you see," he would murmur, and she would answer in her calm, measured way. A sentence, a single phrase, enough to shape a decision without anyone knowing her hand had guided it. Court documents, land disputes, royal marriages, matters once reserved for the highborn, passed beneath her eyes. Letters that shifted alliances were carried in her hands. Requests for favours, for pardons, for vengeance, all whispered into her ear before they ever reached the throne. And those who had once mocked her, once ordered her to scrub their floors, now came to her quietly, carefully, asking, begging, bowing, because they understood now what she had become. Not a maid, not a shadow, but the silence that shaped their world. Her power was invisible, but undeniable. When she spoke, it was law. When she withheld her voice, men trembled, uncertain of where her silence would fall next. Rumours spread across Spain that the king never signed without her counsel, that noble families lived or died by her memory of their sins, that even the church feared the calm gaze of the woman who knew too much, and so she ruled without throne or crown, without sword or army, without ever needing to raise her voice. She sat in plain gowns, her hair bound simply, her presence quiet, her composure unshaken, and yet entire estates bent to her will. Rivalries collapsed at her suggestion, laws bent beneath her silence. The girl born in chains had risen higher than queens. The servant child no one noticed had become the unseen sovereign of Spain. She wore no crown, she didn't need one. Silence had made her Spain's most feared woman. The portraits show her calm, eyes steady, hands folded. A face painted with serenity, though those who once stood before her knew better. They whispered about her long after she was gone. Some swore she poisoned her rivals. Others claimed she carried a ledger of every noble sin, each one stored in silence, waiting to be unleashed. None could prove it. None dared to try. For how do you accuse a woman who never raised her voice? How do you fight an enemy who never revealed her weapon? Her silence became her legend, a presence that lingered in chambers, in letters, in every cautious glance between nobles who feared she might still be listening. She left behind no heirs, no throne, no crown of gold or jewels, and yet her shadow outlived kings. Her name, spoken rarely, spoken carefully, carried more weight than titles carved into stone. Born a servant, crowned in silence, she left behind no heirs, no throne. Only the kind of power history cannot erase,